In this video, we'll discuss absolute change and relative change. Absolute change would be an actual amount of an increase or a decrease. And when we're calculating an amount of an increase or a decrease, often we're needing to find the difference, subtract. A relative change is when we compare that amount of the change to what was our original amount. We do this comparison with a ratio, and we'll end up doing a divide to get a decimal and then a percent. So a relative change is very frequently put in terms of a percent, and the operation that we'll need to do will be a divide. These are some ideas that we're already pretty familiar with based on things we encounter in everyday life. I'll give you a quick example. Think about an absolute change of $1. Think about this $1 change occurring to a cup of coffee, where its original price was $1, and now it has an increase of $1, so its new price is $2. And if you were used to getting your $1 cup of coffee every morning, and then one day you went and the price was up to $2, that would be a very noticeable change. Even though it's just a change, an absolute change of $1, if we were to start to compare it to our original price, we can see that the cost has doubled, which seems significant. And compare this to a sweater that you were thinking of purchasing that cost $50. Now it has an absolute increase of $1, so its new price is $51. And this might not seem like as much of a drastic change. It's still the same absolute change, it's still a $1 increase in both cases, but we can see this difference that we know is there when we calculate the relative change. Cup of coffee, that price has doubled, but the sweater, it's only gone up by a buck from 50 to 51. It doesn't feel like that much of an increase. So let's calculate the relative change. We take that absolute increase of $1, but we're going to compare it to what were the original prices of these two items. The cup of coffee was $1 to begin with, so here's our ratio to compare amount of the change to the original amount. This will give us our relative change. For the sweater, the original amount was $50. We always want to use the original amount when we're calculating relative change. So $1 for the cup of coffee, $50 for the sweater. Now with each of these ratios, let's turn it into a decimal and then a percent. The $1 over $1 equals 1 whole, and 1 whole is 100%. So we can say, well, the amount of the change was exactly 100% of what that original price was. Whatever it cost to begin with, you've basically made that the increase, 1 plus 1, up to $2. But the sweater, 1 out of 50 is only 2%. It felt like a small change because compared to the original price, it is a small amount. So at times we like to consider an absolute change because that truly is the additional money that you're going to have to pay. It's going to cost you an extra $1. Whether you're talking about the coffee or the sweater, it's still just $1 extra. But as a relative change, compared to what those prices were originally, we can see $1 means a lot more to an item that only cost $1 to begin with, compared to something that was already as high as $50. A $1 increase doesn't seem to be as significant. You can pause the video and try this problem, where we find the absolute change and relative change in the price of gold and in the price of silver between January of 2008 and January of 2012. Pause the video and try it, and then restart, and we'll go through the answer. So remember that the absolute change is the amount of the change. We know what the original price was, and we know what the final price was. So subtract that final amount from the original amount. And we see that the actual amount of the increase was $751.25. There's our absolute change, the actual amount of the increase. And to find an increase, we definitely like to arrange the subtraction with the most recent value first, subtract from that the original value. Use that order for calculating the absolute change. Now to figure the relative change, we compare this amount of change to the original amount. So we construct this ratio with the amount of change in the numerator. The reference value is the original amount. In this case, it's the price that is listed for the earliest point in time, back in the year 2008. That's how we'll calculate the relative change, comparing it to what was our original amount. Now we'll divide, and we're going to round to the nearest tenth of a percent. And we'll come up with 88.7%. As the decimal 0.8872, and we're rounding to the nearest tenth of a percent. So move the decimal point twice first to make it a percent, and now round to that nearest tenths place, 88.7%. Let's look at the results for the price of silver. First, the absolute change. Find the difference between the final amount, $28.78, and the original amount, $14.93. And we get an absolute change of $13.85. The actual amount of the increase from January 2008 to January 2012 was $13.85. As a relative change, we'll compare that amount of the change to the original amount, the cost in January 2008, $14.93. It equals approximately 92.8% when we round to the nearest tenth of a percent. So comparing the relative change, we can see that as an investment between 2008 and 2012, the price of silver has actually increased slightly more than the price of gold. The absolute change is definitely much smaller, but it started at a much lower price. So the amount of the change compared to its original price can actually be slightly higher, even if the absolute change is a much smaller actual dollar amount. Let's go through one more example of calculating absolute change and relative change. In this case, we're looking at the median new home price in the United States. In March 2007, it was $262,600. In August 2009, it was $207,100. First, the absolute change. And we know we're finding the difference, the change in prices, but pay attention to the fact that we are decreasing. If you think that we should always follow the model of take the current price and subtract from it the original price, and that's a good strategy to use, we'll see that we come up with a negative number. Negative $55,500. It's the amount of the difference between these two prices, and it's negative to indicate that we have a decreasing home price. What it was in 2007 was much larger than what it was later on in 2009. So keep in mind that we take the current price and subtract from it the original price when we're calculating the absolute change, or the amount of change. And the negative result is just telling us that we have a decrease. Home prices are going down. We have two options. You can write your answer as negative $55,500, or instead of the negative, you could just use the word decrease to indicate that this is an amount that's decreasing. Now let's go and find the relative change. We take that amount of change, we can continue using this negative number for the absolute change, just as a reminder that we are referring to a decrease. And we'll always compare in this ratio the amount of change to the original or the earlier price. In this case, it's the $262,600. We don't want to automatically use the largest or the smallest number that we see. You want to find the number that came earliest in time, what happened originally. And in this scenario, originally was the year 2007, and we're comparing the change from what we saw in 2009 back to what it was in 2007. We're always comparing back to the original amount. So let's divide and write this as a decimal rounded to the nearest tenth. We can call it a relative change of negative 21.2%, or you could call it a relative decrease of 21.2%. The negative sign is just indicating that we have a decrease, so if you actually state with words it's a relative decrease, you can leave that negative sign off. Now we can take the idea about relative change and absolute change a bit further to use these ideas anytime we talk about what is this cost relative to another cost or quantity or amount. So we could answer a question like, what is the tax relative to the income? And remember, when it came to calculating relative change, we needed to start with a ratio. So the amount of the tax relative to the income is thought to be like relative change. Let's compare these two and come up with a percent. Rounding this to the nearest percent, 17%. So the amount of tax relative to the income is 17%. It's a slightly different idea from calculating a change, but still think of this idea when we talk about a relative quantity. We'd like to set it up in a fraction, where we're dividing that amount by a whole amount. In this case, it's the portion of the income that goes to taxes to the entire income. And we can see this is 17%. On this side, what is the amount of tax relative to the income? We're coming up with a ratio to compare one quantity relative to another quantity. This side, the tax is $74,500 relative to the income of $450,000. Looking at this as a percent, it is just a little bit less than 17%. It's actually closer to 16.6%. So we have calculated the amount of the tax relative to the income for each of these scenarios. One has tax that is 17% of the income. The other is slightly lower at 16.6% of total income.